再drastically inflated it up.
Okay. You're fine. Just breathe off the rig, Tina.
Wow, I don't know what's going on. Stop.
Two brothers, one cave, and the dive that would change their lives forever. September 2000. Goss Canyon, La Crescenta-Montrose, California. 39-year-old Air Force pararescue jumper, Paul Francis Hayden, and his brother, 42-year-old Michael Hayden, hiked to one of their favorite childhood spots, a well at the top of a canyon that they had spent many summers cooling off at. It wasn't a well-known location. It could barely be found on a map, and it definitely wasn't a tourist location. It was just theirs. So, when a freak accident resulted in Paul's death, the question arose: how exactly could something so tragic happen to Paul in a place he'd visited a million times before? This is the Goss Canyon tragedy, a cave diving experience gone horribly wrong. Paul Hayden had the potential to be the kind of man who'd punch you in the throat and take all your money. He was physically fit, lithe, and a sergeant in one of the most elite military units. His job as a pararescue jumper, according to the United States Air Force, was to rescue, recover, and return American or Allied forces in times of danger or extreme duress, whether shot down or isolated behind enemy lines, surrounded, engaged, wounded, or captured by the enemy. PJs will do whatever required to deny the enemy a victory and bring our warriors home to fight another day.
Okay, now hold it. What was the update on ops? Two U.S. Mill. Okay, so picking up two confirm. Pick up two Turkish. Is that going to hurt you with only having two medics right now? Do you want to have a medic come bloodbird, or how do you want to work this?
That's basically a lot of words to say that Paul was highly skilled, highly trained, and incredibly brave. His line of work meant he'd succeeded in powering through extensive training, and he'd acquired 17 medals for his military service. Paul also loved extreme sports like ice climbing and hang gliding, and he was always up for an adventure. In an interview with the LA Times, Paul's sister Christine simply said, "Paul was energy." One of his training partners, Chief Pararescueman Victor Villaseñor, said, "The guy was a complete stud. He was strong, in excellent shape. He was kind. He was witty. He was the type of guy who belonged in the movies." Even though Paul had all the requirements of someone who could easily exert their physical strength on others, he was kind and had a gentle soul. Having grown up with 6 brothers and sisters, he loved to spend time with his family whenever he was back home. Although he loved a good challenge, he wasn't one to be so careless. He was cautious and reserved, the kind of person who always double-checked his equipment before going into any operation. So how then did a man like that end up losing his life at a virtually unknown well at the top of a canyon? It was September 17th, 2000. Paul was visiting his family home in La Crescenta-Montrose, an unincorporated area in Los Angeles County, California. Paul, his brother Mike, and their siblings grew up among the rocky hills and sprawling valleys in the area, and the old well at the top of Goss Canyon and the surrounding areas was one spot they loved to hang around as kids. Opened in 1907, the well had long since been abandoned, and the siblings loved to swim in the pools, as well as dive and explore the tunnels. The area was more or less unknown to the public, hidden behind steep granite walls. It was their secret, even well into adulthood. Paul had explored the area many times beforehand, and on that fateful day, he and his brother made the decision to explore farther than they had ever gone before. They got their scuba equipment and hiked their way down the old dirt trails and through the rugged terrain to the site of the well. The well lies within the boundaries of the Angeles National Forest, so what they were doing was more or less illegal, as they didn't have special use permits. But their familiarity with the area meant that they either didn't know or didn't think it was a big deal. At the well, they went in through the 3-by-4-foot entrance, each using a rope to get down into the area. At about 150 feet deep, the pair encountered water and prepared to dive with their scuba gear. Again, this is something they had done multiple times before. Editha Hayden clarified in the interview that often Paul would carry a lighter with him to test the air pockets inside the caverns for poisonous gases. Paul set up a rope as a guideline and told his brother that he had 2 hours of air. Mike was to watch the line, and he was given the instruction that if he didn't surface at that time, he should get help. His primary source of light was a waterproof video camera lamp. Wasting no time at all, Paul dove into the water and began his explorations. He wasn't at all afraid of anything going wrong besides, even if he wasn't familiar with the area. He'd taken on more daunting tasks in the Army. Heck, his training alone was much more difficult than the recreational diving he was doing at Goss Canyon. However, only about 15 minutes into the dive, something went terribly wrong. Paul had been exploring a narrow passage in the water. The area was dark, cold, and swimming through it pushed up silt, lowering the little visibility his camera light had managed to give him, but that was far from the worst of it. As he squeezed into the tunnel, his rope got tangled, and he found that he couldn't move properly, couldn't get out. Paul struggled to free himself, but if he struggled too hard, there was silt to worry about, and he wouldn't be able to see the way out. But if he stayed in place, he would just run out of air. Paul was trapped in the dark, alone despite the fact that his brother was only a few feet above him, watching the same line that held him down. And it's not that Mike didn't notice something was wrong. He did. He pulled at the line but found that he couldn't move it. It was like pulling a rock. Paul was in the dark, cold water struggling for his survival, and all Mike had in his hands was a lifeline that didn't work. Imagine jumping from a high place believing the net your siblings were watching down below would catch you, only for them to find out, right after you jumped, that the net was actually torn. Mike pulled as hard as he could, desperately trying to pull Paul out of danger, but the rope was relentless. It wouldn't budge. Whatever it had caught on was giving no leeway for the brothers to work with. In a last-ditch effort to at least make sure that Paul was still all right in the water, Mike tugged on the rope, hoping to get something back. They could communicate via rope. Perhaps 2 definitive tugs from Paul would be a signal that all was well and he'd get out soon. But there was nothing. No slight tug, no twitch if the rope, absolutely nothing. The lack of motion on the line was daunting enough to send Mike panicking. It was enough to hint at what had really happened to his brother. Ignoring the wait 2 hours instruction, Mike hurried to the La Crescenta Sheriff's Office, barging into the building at around 1:20 p.m. in search of help. Moments later, rescuers from several agencies hurried to the site, skipping the hike and speedily reaching there in 4-wheel drive vehicles. Rescue divers wasted no time in going into the well in search of Paul Hayden, and they did find him, just not in the way they and Paul's family had hoped. Rescue diver Mark Lonsdale was the one who found Paul's body in the water, lying about 185 feet into a horizontal narrow section, well over 400 feet from the entrance. The body was discovered at about 3:45 p.m., and it was found caught between a rock and a steel beam. It was no wonder Mike couldn't get his brother out of there. Paul had been squeezed tight between 2 immovable objects, and with his rope tangled, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to swim to. He probably clawed at his surroundings for an exit, only to touch rock, steel, and more rock. It's even more daunting to know that the shaft where Paul's body was found was only half full of water, and, when he was found, his head was above the surface. His exact cause of death remains a mystery. He still had enough oxygen in his scuba tank, and his regulators were still in place. However, a theory to his cause of death is that he became asphyxiated in air filled with carbon dioxide. Perhaps it was just that the tight space his body was wedged in made it so that he found it hard to breathe even with the oxygen in his tank, although his regulators being in place indicated that he'd run out of air before getting trapped. Either way, we do know one thing for certain. Paul Hayden was trapped so tightly in that space that the divers who attempted to retrieve his body couldn't because it was wedged too tightly to be moved. 2 brothers, 1 cave. An adventure they'd taken many times before ending in tragedy. Paul was an expert pararescue jumper with many medals to his name and career. However, cave diving is a terrain so far removed from any other that extreme caution is advised, as even professionals meet their end in the labyrinths of deep, cold waters.